Hi, it's me again. This is lab number 3. We're going to be talking about molecular biology. By the way, this series of lab talks that I'm giving here, they are a shortened, condensed kind of Reader's Digest version of the molecular biology lectures that you will find over on the lectures side of the course. I strongly recommend that you watch all of my lectures. It's like an hour and 45 minutes, but this is going to be my shortened version of them. Let me start my timer, okay? So keep in mind that there's more detail when you go through all of my lectures on the lecture side of the class. By the way, molecular biology, if you have got, an uncle or an older sibling who might give you a hard time, like, what are you learning in that fancy school of yours, right? You're going to want to learn this stuff because if all you need to say to them is molecular biology and talk to them about the difference between DNA and RNA and how nucleotides are made out of phosphate sugars and bases. And did you know what a real gene was? And then they'll just walk away mumbling about, oh, I got street smarts, and you win. Okay, so molecular biology. Molecular biology is the general term for this topic of why do we have DNA? What's that all about? You learned when we were learning about the parts of the cell that human cells have got structures inside of them called organelles. You learned about the different organelles, and two of those organelles are very important for this topic. First of all, inside of our cells, there's an area called the nucleus, and the nucleus is like the CEO's building, the executive office building inside of the factory complex, right? And the important thing about the nucleus is this is the place where this material called DNA is housed and organized and kept safe. The DNA that is in all of our cells has got all of the information that your cell needs in order to make a perfect you. Almost all of your cells have got a nucleus and they have got DNA inside of them. And if I take out the nucleus of any of your cells, I will have all of the instructions for making you. Your height, your amount of muscle mass, your eye color, all of those things are going to be in the form of DNA. So DNA, that's the big old instruction manual for how to make for me, how to make a Dr. Tydell, right? Now, that's one of the organelles that's important. The other organelle that's important here are the ribosomes. And remember, the ribosomes are the little machines inside of your cell that actually build proteins. And we know from our enzyme lab and also from lecture that proteins make up all of the machines that allow your cells to do the things that make them alive. And if your cells are alive, then you can be alive, right? Now, we're going to start with DNA. DNA is a heart-stoppingly enormous molecule, all right? You've learned about atoms, and you know that atoms are the basic components of matter that have the properties of an element. So carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, phosphate, right? And then those get put together, and when they get put together, we call that a molecule. Some molecules are very small, like NaCl, let's do water, H2O. This is a molecule with two atoms of hydrogen and one atom of oxygen, right? That's a molecule. That's only 3 atoms big. Let me tell you about DNA. DNA is a molecule that is made up of, basically, it's 1 trillion times as big as a water molecule. The molecules of DNA that are inside of your cell are so big that when you do your lab activity on Connecta this week, you'll be reenacting a lab that we actually can do in real life, where you end up with threads of DNA out of cells that are like almost like spaghetti. Well, more like little rice noodles. Okay. So DNA is enormous. This picture right here, I'm like most instructors, they'll say, okay, there's an example of DNA. Is that an example of DNA? Not really. So each one of these things right here, there's a T, there's an A. We'll get back to those in a second. This is referred to as one base pair. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 base pairs. 10 base pairs here. One of your chromosome will be millions of base pairs big. So is this DNA? It's a little tiny chunk of DNA, this little tiny piece. And here, when we show you the DNA here, we're showing you the way it looks like a spiral staircase. Remind me to come back to that because that's also important. Your DNA is made out of 2 strands. We call them strands, 2 strands. Here is one strand, okay? And then I'll change colors here. Here is the other strand. Okay, 2 strands. These strands fit together like 2 halves of a mold. Over here, I've got a picture of an ancient piece of pottery on the left, and on the right, this is the mold that ancient piece of pottery was made out of. DNA strands, these 2 strands, are like the 2 parts of a mold. They are not identical, right? The pottery and the pottery over here and the mold over here, they're not identical, but they fit together. So wherever there is a ridge over here, there's going to be a groove over there, right? Straight grooves, curvy grooves, straight ridges, curvy ridges, they fit together. These 2 strands of DNA, they fit together in a very special way. And that is really clever because here is the challenge that life, like you and I, here's the challenge that we have to solve. Life with a capital L, okay? Here's the challenge we had to solve. In order to get as big as we are, we had to go from being 1 cell big, 1 little tiny cell, to trillions of cells big by the time you are you. Actually, even more than that, because most of the cells that you have been in your life, they flaked off and they're in the sewer or laying on the ground somewhere. So think about how complicated this entire instruction manual is not like an instruction manual. It's more like the Cerritos College Library. It's more like a library that's filled with lots and lots of books. And each one of those books is filled with instructions for how to make a protein, how to make a perfect Dr. Tydell, okay? So imagine every time you went from 1 cell to 2 cells, from 2 cells to 4 cells, from 4 cells to 8 cells, trillions of times. Every time you did that, you had to make a copy of this entire library of information, okay? How do you do that and not make mistakes? Imagine, let's look at your lab manual. Pause the video and get your lab manual. You're going to want your lab manual here. But let's imagine just 1 page of the lab manual, okay? 1 page. Now, let me ask you, I am going to give it to the first person at the front of the classroom, and they need to write it out. They need to print it out on a piece of paper and hand it to the person next to them, who will print it out, who will read the copy and rewrite it and hand it to the person next to them, right? Now, imagine if you start out with your actual printed page, but through the classroom, Each student is going to copy it down and hand the copy they make to the person next door. What's it going to look like by the time it gets to student number 30? It's going to be a mess, right? You know, because little tiny mistakes, where a period is put, or the spelling of a word, little tiny mistakes are going to crop up. Cells had to face that same problem too, right? We've got to make a copy of this stuff called DNA that's millions and millions of base pairs big, and we need to do it millions and millions of times in our lifetime. And if we ever make a mistake, then either the cell will die or it might turn into a cancerous cell and then you will die. Big problem. This two-part mold situation is how life with a capital L solved the problem. Now, I mentioned that this stuff called DNA is made out of individual base pairs. So here and here, that's a base pair, right? So what do I mean by that? Well, the actual DNA structure is made out of building blocks that are called nucleotides. Building blocks, remember monomers. DNA is an excellent example of a polymer. It is a heart-stoppingly enormous polymer made out of monomers that are known as nucleotides. By the way, I'm going to pause right here so we can go over monomers and polymers. All right. So nucleotides are the monomers that make up nucleic acids. And there are two basic types of nucleic acids. There is DNA that we've already started talking about. Later on, we will talk about RNA. Great. Every nucleotide is made out of three things. It is made out of a phosphate group that in chemical terms can also be represented as phosphoric acid. And that's a chemistry thing. And I really don't want to burden you with the reason why it can be two things, okay? We're going to call it phosphate usually, but in the lab, I think the pieces that you'll work with say phosphoric acid. Same diff, okay? And then there is a sugar molecule, and you can recognize that. Look, carbons, hydrogens, oxygens, making a ring-like structure, that is a sugar. And the sugar for DNA is deoxyribose. And then hanging off one side will be a nitrogenous base. A nitrogenous base, or you could just shorthand it and call it a base. Why is it called a nitrogenous base? Because it has nitrogens in it. Yeah, that's the only reason. Oh, and it's basic. If you put it in water, it's basic. Okay? A nitrogenous base. So nucleotides are the building blocks of nucleic acids. The most important nucleic acids are DNA and RNA. Every nucleotide is made out of a phosphate, a sugar, and a base. The sugar for DNA is deoxyribose. DNA stands for deoxyribose nucleic acid, right? So two kinds of nucleic acids, DNA and RNA. And now you know the N and the A stand for nucleic acid. And the D in DNA stands for deoxyribose. Actually, it stands for deoxyribo because they make it one word, okay? Deoxyribonucleic acid. So nucleotides. Now, nitrogenous bases. In DNA, there are 4 different nucleotides that are found in DNA. There are 4 different nucleotides because a nucleotide of DNA can have 4 different bases, and they are adenine, guanine, cytosine, and this one, thymine. Let's talk about that some more, okay? DNA is built using millions of nucleotide molecules, like millions of them, right? But I can separate out all of those millions into just 4 types. And there will be nucleotides that have adenine as their base, nucleotides that have guanine as their base, nucleotides that have thymine as their base, and nucleotides that have cytosine as their base. These are the 4 different DNA bases, and the 4 different DNA nucleotides will have one of those on there, okay? So let's look at a basic nucleotide, phosphate, sugar, base. The 4 different bases are G, A, T, and C. G, A, T, and C, there once was a movie called Gattaca. I do not know if I'm spelling it properly. The movie was called Gattaca, and it starred Uma Thurman, Jude Law, and Ethan Hawke back when they were your age, and they were adorable. And the movie Gattaca is about a science fiction future where your DNA dictates your entire life. If you're going to go to medical school, they take you a sample of DNA and they let your DNA decide if you should go to medical school. So the movie was called Gattaca. And that's how I remember the names of the 4 different DNA bases. It's G, A, T, and C. Gattaca. All right? The other thing about DNA is DNA has got deoxyribose as its sugar, and DNA is double-stranded, so that one strand is like the mold and the other strand is like the piece of pottery. Okay? We're going to pick up there at the next video.